This is an attempt by kind of foregrounding the issue rather than necessarily Farage himself to try and kind of win people back. It will take not just one press conference, it's going to take a lot more than that, I think.
Reform is putting small boats back on the political agenda, and this is why. Hello and welcome to another week of This Is Why. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage held a press conference today in which he announced a new policy idea to deploy the Royal Navy in the Channel to stop small boat crossings. But this isn't the first time Nigel Farage has floated the idea of using the Navy. In 2025, he said he wasn't completely ruling out the idea of sending dinghies back to France. Today, he categorically ruled out pushing the small boats back, insisting his new policy idea is about escorting migrants back to France and Belgium as part of a humanitarian mission. Critics say Reform's policy is unworkable and illegal, and an attempt to distract from ongoing questions about Nigel Farage's finances and a paused parliamentary investigation into the former MP. But with the Spanish government currently grappling a crisis in Ceuta, where tens of thousands of migrants entered the Spanish exclave within just 24 hours, Reform clearly believe public opinion could shift in their favour. I'm joined by Alain Tolhurst, Chief Reporter at Politics Home. Alain, just explain to me what Reform is promising.
Well, they're essentially promising, I think, the largest maritime operation, I think, since the Second World War, and an attempt to try and use the full force or the might of the British Royal Navy to really tackle the small boats crisis, which we've seen kind of numbers coming down, but they're saying that's nowhere near effective enough.
So what does that look like? Can you put some flesh on the bones? They're talking about the Navy, they're talking about escorting people back to France. I mean, what's the detail of this policy? I mean,
there's not a huge amount of detail. Essentially, they want to create an integrated surveillance command. That was Zai Youssef, their Home Affairs spokesman, was talking about kind of it would unify military and intelligence surveillance and making us the most surveilled maritime border in the world. But yes, you're also right in terms of what they will do physically is use the Royal Navy boats to turn back boats, take them back into French waters and potentially back to the French beaches and to deposit people back onto the French land. How that will happen in practice, how likely the French are to accept that, obviously is much to be discussed, and obviously the legality of it as well, the maritime conventions that the UK is part of, that again is yet to be kind of to be decided as well.
Yeah, so they're saying that actually they're not going to be pushing boats back. They say that that can potentially be dangerous if the boat is much smaller, it can capsize the boat. So they're saying they would pick people up in the English Channel, take them onto the Navy ships and then take them back to France or back to Belgium. Do we think that's realistic? This has been looked at before, no?
The issue with the small boats has been tried before. The Royal Navy had involvement with the border force between 2019 and 2023, and then it kind of ended, and they didn't feel as though actually it was really much use for them, and kind of the rules around the kind of use of engagement and force and how the Royal Navy is used obviously is kind of a bit murky, and I don't think the Royal Navy was particularly happy about it. So Zai Youssef was saying, look, we would far rather disembark people in port, walk them down a gangway and hand them to the French authorities properly, saying that was kind of a more dignified and what they would want to negotiate for. But there is no suggestion at the moment that the French would be willing to accept that. I mean, he was saying that, look, if the Elysee Palace refuses, the Royal Marines will disembark them safely on the shore that they left. But how that would go in terms of our relationships with France, it seems very unlikely that we'd be able to get away with doing something like that if the French are against it.
Zai Youssef has said he's happy to have this argument with the French, and Reform are trying to say that, look, something needs to be done, and they are happy to fight, not literally, not physically, but fight the French over this.
And I don't think it's likely that the French, whoever is in charge in France by the time there is an election in this country and a potential reform government is looking to impact this kind of policy, that anyone would be willing to accept this. And I think as well, if you talk to kind of maritime legal experts, they say that actually this kind of policy would require perhaps removing ourselves from these kind of international conventions that we're part of. And again, would a government, even a reform government, really want to get involved in doing that sort of thing just to enact this particular aspect of the policy?
So, Alan, how new or fresh is this policy idea? Because Labour have come out and said that this is just reform, but rehashing their old ideas to distract from some of their difficulties around bad headlines for Nigel Farage's finances, for instance. And the Tory party said that they looked at this previously when they were in government, but the legality was too difficult, so they didn't end up implementing something like this. Is this really that new?
No, you're completely right. It's definitely been looked at multiple times, and we heard, certainly from the right wing of the Conservative Party in the last Parliament, there was an awful lot of those MPs who wanted to see the Home Office go further and utilise the military in this stuff, and to do with you mentioned pushback, and that was one of the things that was seen as legally being very, very difficult to implement, and so therefore this kind of picking up people and taking them back. But even that was kind of thrown out, tossed aside, because essentially France would not wear it. I think it kind of shows how kind of Reform want to kind of shift the narrative on this. If you think about this time last year, Reform was still doing really well in the polls, and they were really kind of grasping the kind of the narrative by having these regular press conferences. We haven't seen these regular press conferences from Reform in recent months because of kind of the problems that Nigel Farage has been facing. Clearly, they're looking to kind of test the waters and see if they can kind of get on the front foot again. I think for the first time really in Reform's history, they've been in more of a defensive posture, in kind of a crouch and defending themselves. They're now looking to kind of to go on the attack, and they see obviously immigration and tackling small boats as being one of their kind of key areas where they still have a lead over all the other parties, and lead with that, rather than kind of having to face these kind of defensive questions about kind of all the various financial problems that the party seems to find itself in.
Well, let's talk about those problems for a second. I mean, let's look at the timing of this announcement. Reform, as you say, are going through some difficulties. They're having a lot of scrutiny and questions about their funding, about the parliamentary investigation that's been paused into Nigel Farage because he triggered that by-election in Clacton, for instance. How much of an obstacle, or a mountain, should I say, politically is Reform facing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's facing its first real kind of big crisis. It's sort of hit a kind of a ceiling on its support. And as we know, that even with this kind of multi-party politics, you still need to be around sort of 35% or at least 30% to be in line to try and get a majority at an election. They're struggling, they've dropped back, this kind of so-called burn and bounce. Obviously, it's very early days and only a couple of polls. I think it was interesting today that Nigel Farage was perhaps not as tetchy as he has been in some press conferences, but he did still kind of get a bit annoyed with the questions in the Q&A about kind of his finances, his relationship with the aide George Cottrell, and the various kind of other financial issues that Reform are facing. And it is the first time they're facing this significant kind of questioning, this scrutiny. It feels like there's quite an awful lot more to come. We saw Richard Tice, the deputy leader, there's a new parliamentary investigation into him announced this morning about not declaring a particular interest. So it does feel as though they're going to have to basically be able to get through this and show that they can face down these issues if they are to push on through ahead of that election and get towards that kind of figure, and be able to ride the kind of burn and bounce and show that they are still in pole position to form the next government.
And Alan, when we're looking at the timing of this, do you think what we saw in Ceuta, that area that is technically Spain, that borders Morocco, where we saw tens of thousands of people entering over the border or through the sea in a matter of 24 hours. Do you think that has anything to do with it, or do you think this is just opportunistic timing?
I think Reform had been planning to make a press conference around this new operation Operation Fortress, that had been in the books, I think, for a good few days now. And I think also the fact that Andy Burnham was there in Dover at the weekend is also kind of helpful timing. I think they were always going to do it in the height of summer, because as we know, that is when the most likely we are to see those crossings. And although the crossings are down about 40%, I think, year on year at the moment, the last couple of weeks have seen a big uptick, obviously, with this very kind of calm and sunny weather that we're seeing. But as you say, it's kind of, for them, quite fortunate to have both the kind of the Ceuta situation and also Andy Burnham making it a focus of his policies and his announcements over the weekend as well. I mean, yeah, it still feels a long way away from getting any agreement that would allow these policies to take place. And there's just no, I mean, the French response has been kind of a tongue-in-cheek response, referring to Mr. Farage as, I think the translation is Mr. Wacky, I think is the translation.
I would translate it as Mr. Far-fetched. partly because they're trying to make a play on words with the far, as in Farage, right? So I would call it Mr. Far-fetched. And I think that's what they've nicknamed him, Monsieur Farfelu. And they're basically trying to say, look, this is ridiculous and it's not going to happen.
I'm half French, so you should. Yeah, it's embarrassing for me that you managed to translate the French better than I have there. But but yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's both the policy I think from the UK side and how likely it is to engage the military in this kind of activity, which they've shown pretty, as I said before, they've shown pretty kind of reticence to be able to get involved in this way, because the fact is that there is an inalienable right to allow asylum, and the military can't just prevent that by turning people around and taking them somewhere else. And there's lots of other issues as well. You know, the Navy has obligations to someone who's an enemy combatant in the water, let alone someone who is not an enemy combatant, who is an asylum seeker.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Labour, and you mentioned Andy Burnham in Dover over the weekend, and he said he wants to have a kind of laser focus on small boats crossings. He clearly sees that it is an electoral area that he needs to focus on. It's potentially a weak spot for Labour.
Yeah, they've always been targeted as being kind of so-called soft on immigration, having open borders, that sort of thing. And I think he was, Andy Burnham obviously is, by going out there and having this being in Dover, I think was good visually for him to do, and he didn't kind of use those kind of same stock phrases. There was no kind of smash the gang, stop the boats kind of catchphrase. I think he knows that those things that the public kind of don't really enjoy those, especially when what they see with their own eyes is not an ability to stop the boats or smash the gangs. But it does feel as though it's something that he's going to have to fix. I think, if you look at the first week that he was in power, there was a lot of stuff that he could try and do in the short term that would have a kind of meaningful change early on. And then since then, he's tried to kind of make a start on the more knotty issues, things like social care and obviously the needs and education. And I think clearly immigration and the small boats is going to be one of those issues that he has to try and deal with in the long term. So getting a start on it now, it does pull focus towards it, which is one of the things that people are less confident about them doing. But the fact is that if he doesn't get it sorted now, if this continues and it allows reform to continue to kind of punch that bruise, then I think they'll find themselves in a bit of trouble on immigration.
Alan, Reform have dropped a bit in the polls recently. Do you think this is the right strategy for them to try and restore their lead?
It's clearly an attempt to remind people who started backing Reform in the first place why they were so drawn towards Nigel Farage's party. So it's an attempt to kind of to reframe where they are, because a lot of the kind of negativity around Nigel Farage personally, Politics Zone, we work with Thinks Insight, a strategy company that looked at kind of potential Labour switches, potential Tory switches to Reform, and actually some of the ones who were kind of softly in favour, they did talk about Nigel Farage being a bit of a barrier towards that it was a bit of a one-man band, that they liked this idea, that some of the policies, but they weren't perhaps sure about Nigel Farage. And so I think this is an attempt, by kind of foregrounding the issue rather than necessarily Farage himself, to try and kind of win people back. And as you say, it will take not just one press conference, it's going to take a lot more than that, I think. But if they continue to kind of get on the front foot on this, then I think that's how they see kind of a return, or they hope to see a return to kind of them being more ascendant in the polls.
And I suppose when we look at the polls at the moment, I mean, they're shifting all the time, and we are so far from a general election that obviously we have to take it all with a pinch of salt. But I think the Reform Party would probably admit that they'd be disappointed with the fact that they're not maybe eating into the Tory vote as much as they like at the moment, for instance.
If we look at kind of the recent by-elections, the Greater Manchester mayoralty election, the Tories have been doing really, really badly. And a lot of talk in Westminster, where you and I work, is about kind of how well that Kemi Badenoch is doing, that she's doing better as a leader, etc. But the proof of that is how well they do when it comes to people actually putting that cross in the ballot box. And in that sense, the Tories are still doing really, really badly. So I think Reform are probably quite secure in thinking they can squeeze out a lot of the Tory vote. I think where it's interesting is how much of the vote on the right they can squeeze from the other smaller parties, the kind of parties on the right, including Restore and Rupert Lowe's party. I think that's where they're going to be their focus on. I think they're not. If you speak to people in Reform, they're not too worried about the Tories. They think this resurgence is a bit of a kind of a confected narrative.
Well, let's talk about Restore and Rupert Lowe. They took almost 9% of the Manchester mayor by-election. Nigel Farage at that press conference today acknowledged that actually Restore was eating into their vote. So Reform have been quite open about the fact that Restore is harming them electorally. I mean, there's so much we can go on when it comes to Restore, but first of all, let's talk about the polling, then let's talk about Rupert Lowe.
This whole thing started with a constituency poll in Makerfield back in the ahead of that May election, which essentially put Restore, I think, was on 7 or 9%, and that we felt as though that could be the difference, because that could be the difference. If Andy Burnham was to win that by-election, the feeling was the gap between him and the Reform candidate would be less than the amount of votes that Restore got, and therefore Restore would be spoiling kind of Reform's chances of winning. And in a general election, in lots of places up in the North and the Midlands where Labour are looking to repeat their wins they did in 2024, that Restore would spoil Reform's chances of victory in those places. Obviously, it wasn't quite as close in the end as that, but clearly, as you say, the Manchester mayoral by-election shows that Restore can get up to close to kind of 10%, and if they did do that in lots of seats across England, then they would really damage Reform's chances. And so I think, whereas Nigel Farage has been quite critical of the idea of a pact between Reform and the Tories, he did seem a bit more open-minded. He used that phrase in the press conference today. I think he also said that he deserves an apology from Rupert Lowe.
Let's rewind for a minute and just explain what the beef is between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. And Zia Youssef is actually involved, isn't he?
They fell out pretty spectacularly early last year, and Rupert Lowe, was alleged to have kind of made threatening remarks and to have basically been, I think in Nigel Farage's words today at the press conference, the screaming, the shouting, the threats, the legal writs, he said. And then basically Rupert Lowe left Reform as one of their MPs and started his own party earlier this year. And part of that was to do with his relationship with Zia Youssef. They apparently disagreed massively on points of policy, and like a lot of people who do fall out with Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe's been kind of throwing a lot of darts back at Nigel Farage, saying that, calling him kind of, self-absorbed and a narcissist, and been very, very critical of him and very critical of where Reform have been going on policy. He's been wanting to see them move much further to the right on immigration, things like remigration, deportations, that sort of thing, which obviously Reform has not been in favour of so far. And so it's kind of interesting to see him now reaching this potential, this olive branch.
Yeah, I mean, Nigel Farage's tone in that press conference when he was asked many, many times about Rupert Lowe and Restore. And as you say, his tone had softened, he was more open-minded. And even when Zia Youssef was asked about his relationship with Rupert Lowe and whether he would feel threatened or whether he would feel unsafe if Rupert Lowe were to come back, Zia Youssef basically said, look, it's besides the point. So the mood music from Reform seems to be this softening toward Restore. The question really is whether they can actually work together. Rupert Lowe wants things like, a referendum on the death penalty. He wants to ban the burqa and halal meat, things that, as you say, Reform haven't yet said they want to do. And so is that gap just that little bit too wide between those parties and those two leaders?
Yeah, I think so. I think at the moment it's a long way from coming to some sort of agreement on things. But I think clearly, ultimately, Rupert Lowe knows that his power is in trying to spoil Reform's chance of victory, and it's in that sense what he can get in return for preventing that from happening. And so if he can drag Reform into some of those, perhaps not all of them, into some of those policy areas, and to get an agreement on those in order to perhaps stand down candidates. But it does feel as though, as you say, there is a bit of at least an open dialogue between the two parties around this stuff.
Don't forget to get in touch with your ideas for future episodes by emailing us at why@sky.uk. And This Is Why will be back tomorrow.